Hey everyone, it's Spex. Today's podcast is brought to you by Canna Provisions. Canna Provisions is an adult use cannabis dispensary with the largest selection of cannabis products in Western Mass, with locations in both Holyoke and in Lee. They offer a warm, unique shopping experience with guides rather than bud tenders. In fact, they're not just a dispensary, they're a destination. Visit cannaprovisions.com. That's cannaprovisions.com. Adults 21, please, and please consume responsibly. And now, Baxi's musical podcast.
It's Bexy's musical podcast.
Whenever a celebrity passes away, we tend to fixate on their public legacy. It's a way in which we connect to their loss, but what we fail to sometimes consider is that a person's legacy isn't just about their professional accomplishments or their place in history. Their real legacy lies in the people they leave behind, their children, their family, their loved ones, who are sometimes left with the tireless responsibility of curating that legacy while simultaneously dealing with their own grief and their own sense of loss. In some respects, it's just a part of human nature to look at the grief of others and somehow make it our own without any real understanding of what was really left behind. In 2011, Styrene, the lead singer of the legendary UK punk band X-Ray Spex, died of cancer at the age of 53. Styrene was a groundbreaking artist who not only released one of the most essential punk albums of its time with 1978's Germ-Free Adolescence, it was an album that included 3 top 40 singles in the UK charts. This was a band that was arguably as influential as some of its other contemporaries like The Clash or the Sex Pistols. They appeared on the BBC's Top of the Pops. They came to New York and appeared before a packed crowd at CBGB's. But more importantly, Polly Styrene was also the first biracial woman to front her own punk band in the UK while facing discrimination and a growing battle with mental illness brought on in part by the bewildering pressures of success and sheer exhaustion. And while she may have been known to her fans for her positive lyrics, her outrageous day-glow style, at home, she was just known as Marion Elliott Said, the mother of an only child, her daughter Celeste. And that's really where her true legacy begins and where it belongs. Celeste Bell, the daughter of Polly Styrene, is about to release an amazingly beautiful documentary about her mother's life called Polly Styrene, I Am a Cliché. She and director Paul Singh pieced together a beautifully crafted tribute to one of the most complex women in music history. It's a touching story that takes an honest look into her mother's personal demons, as well as confronting some of her own. This is my conversation with Celeste Bell, the daughter of Marion Elliott Said, also known as Polly Styrene from X-Ray Spex, on Baxi's musical podcast. How are you?
Good. How are you, Michael?
Very, very good. Thank you so much for doing this and and rescheduling it. It's nice to know that when an internet problem comes, it's not always my fault. So that's good. I don't mind blaming you at all. I rarely do this. I saw the film not once, but I actually saw it twice. And
Oh, wow.
and the reason for that is, the first time I loved it and I watched it as a fan of your mom. But the second time I really wanted to focus on unpacking what was really in there. It is a beautiful tribute to your mom. And on one hand, what's interesting to me about it is you're honoring your mom and her successes and her struggles, but at the same time, in order for you to tell that story, you're really confronting your own vulnerabilities too. And that I assume that had to be a very difficult story for you to tell.
Yes, of course it's challenging, but it was the only story that I could tell because I think, honesty, being honest and open, that makes for better storytelling. So clearly, like someone as sort of remarkable as my mother, that obviously that is not going to be always, having a relationship with someone who's that like creative and unique and individual as she was. There were always going to be challenges, naturally there are going to be challenges when that person is also your parent, especially if they are struggling with mental health difficulties as she did. She suffered from bipolar disorder, and she lived a very unorthodox lifestyle. Even post X-ray Spex, she joined the Hare Krishna movement, in the 80s when I was a small child. So, of course, to tell that story honestly, I would have to, also talk about the challenges and the difficulties, and how it wasn't all like uh, a walk in the park, let's say.
Yeah. What were you hoping people would understand about your mom in telling the story? Like you said, I mean, there's a lot of complicating factors in her life, and mental illness plays a huge part in this. But there's also the fact. I mean, you're talking about a woman at the time of her, at the height of her music career, was 19 and 20 years old. I mean, really just a child. What are you hoping that people you take away from this as far as who your mom was really all about?
Yeah, that's right. She was so young, and I think the remarkable thing about my mother is that she lived many lives. She had many names, and so people knew her as Polly. People knew her as Marion. That was her real name, her birth name. Marie, and then Maharani when she joined the Hare Krishna movement, and then to me she was mum. So that for me is like what I was really keen on, alongside Paul. We were really keen to kind of bring to light these contradictions. Yeah. So this is a person who had many names, she had many identities, she had many personalities, and she lived many lives. Polystyrene was a very early, manifestation, let's say, or incarnation of who she was when she was a teenager, and she achieved so much at such a young age. But then she had this whole life after that, which was just as fascinating, maybe even more so. So it was really, yeah, we were really keen to, not just dwell on, Polystyrene as a musician, but also Marion Elliott, also Mom, also Maharani, all of these other identities.
You mentioned earlier on in the film, and I actually thought this was a very interesting point. Here in the States, we view celebrity in a very different way than other parts of the world, obviously. You mentioned a part where that you were bearing responsibility for managing your mother's legacy. And it's interesting
Mhm.
to me because, here in the States, we've lost a number of, celebrities in the last couple of months. And we oftentimes, as fans of these people, kind of misplace where the legacy should lie. It's not just about their public achievements, but their legacy really lies in the people that are left behind. In your mom's case, that's you. But in some regards, you're telling the story. What it really says to me is, in a way, you've always been doing this for your mom. I mean, you're a child with a celebrity mom. You may or may not understand what's going on with her career, and at some point you're talking about how boring it is to sit there and listen to your mom go through interviews. But I think there's something to be said about it, being the offspring of somebody famous has a lot of responsibility to go along with it.
Absolutely, and it's not a role that you would necessarily choose or a situation you would necessarily want to be born into, because um, you know first of all, I think there's this misconception that it's a charmed life, and a life of wealth and opportunities. And that's often not the case, because fame, and we talk about this in the film, is a very important message. I think fame does not equal money or wealth. There are a lot of famous people who find it very difficult to make a living, especially once your name is out there, and to do anything else. So you're kind of trapped in a sense. You can't just go and get a regular job after you've been on, TV singing and dancing. So you're kind of trapped into that lifestyle. And if you're born into it, it's something you can never be rid of, because it will always kind of hang over you, in the sense of, yes, responsibility, um, and people, your parent is not only your parent. Basically, your parent means a lot to a lot of people that you don't even know, and those people want to they want to, they want to know about her through you, so it's something that you have to make peace with. It's very difficult to just walk away. And I'm also an only child. So there's no one else really that I could share this with, this responsibility. But of course, it's also an honor, and there are privileges and there are opportunities. And, it's definitely allowed me to express myself creatively in this way through the medium of film, which has, been a remarkable journey. So, when at the beginning, you maybe, when I say like, oh, I had to deal with all of this, I wasn't ready. Yes, that's kind of how I have felt throughout my life at many times, but I am also grateful. And I balanced out that kind of maybe stress that I've experienced with this sort of legacy, with the luck that I have, that I get to explore such an interesting, fascinating story, and that be part of my story.
Your mother, yeah, as you've mentioned earlier here, is yeah, a very multifaceted individual. There's no question about that. I mean, she's not only a woman fronting her own punk band, she's a biracial woman fronting her own punk band. But there's a part of the film which I just thought was just like so aggravating to watch, and I'm sure it probably I'm sure it happens even today. There's a whole bunch of questions to your mom from the media, mostly men who are asking questions about your mother's looks and her
Yeah.
braces, and the fact that she didn't look like Linda Ronstadt, the very same thing that was inspiring a lot of young women at the time. It's funny how your mom saying so much about identity and individuality, and here's someone who is expressing it but yet being punished by it by a pretty insensitive media. I mean, it had to be so difficult and maddening to watch those tapes and then watch your mom react to those kinds of questions.
Definitely, it's maddening, but it's also, I love those moments, because my mum really, even though sometimes you can see that she was affected, of course she was affected, and it had a negative impact on her self-esteem, but you also see her kind of, like challenging that behavior as well, even if the challenge was just by being, like deadpan and non-committal, and and not answering in the way that they wanted, and not really playing that game, that game of, you go on a TV show and they ask you stupid questions and you kind of go. My mum was never really going along with it, and she was really being true to her, to who she was, in those interviews. There's no like fake charm, or she's kind of charmless to the extent, and I love that. And so just seeing that, I'm like, you go girl, go mom, it's great to see.
In the film, you also mentioned about how by the age of 4, you were starting to notice, that there were issues with your mom, mental health issues. And at the part where the band X-Ray Spex goes to New York, and that seemed to be like the door that kind of led your mom down a pretty dark path. At a young age, and observing changes in your mom, whether they're slow or dramatic, especially when she comes back. As a kid, how were you led to understand what was going on with your mom, or even could you understand what was going on with your mom?
Yeah, I couldn't really, when I was very small, I couldn't really understand. So I didn't really know what was going on in terms of my mother's mental health. Maybe I could understand if she was in a good mood or a bad mood, but that was really about the extent of it. And I think when I was around 4 or 5 years old, started to kind of be able to see how other people saw her, and that was very traumatic, because yes, I basically started to understand that there was something wasn't right in in the way that my mother was responding to things, or that there was something wrong with her brain, essentially. That I kind of got that understanding when I was little. That's kind of how I saw it. There's something wrong with my mum's brain. It doesn't work in the same way as other people's. It doesn't work in the same way as mine. So that was it was very traumatic, because you don't want to think of your parent who's your primary caregiver, as not being able to really look after you. Because when you have that realization, you feel very vulnerable. And especially if you're a small child, then you're like, well, who the hell's going to look after me? I guess a part of me realized at an early age I had to look after myself.
The scene in which she's at CBGB's in New York, she's getting off stage. Your mom is not, a tall woman. She's a very small, petite woman, 4'5" or whatever. Really very tiny, being practically mauled by people as she's getting off the stage. You see, her getting off the stage, and there are all these men trying to, plant a kiss in your mom's face, and really overwhelming her. Tell me about New York, and what was it in your mind that when you look at the footage, or even as she described it, what was it about New York that was so overwhelming and ultimately dangerous for her?
I think it was mainly the heavy, heavy, heavy drug taking that was happening at the time on the New York scene, that wasn't as prevalent in the UK at the time. So that was a big difference. And my mum was kind of exposed to that. And I think, but beyond that, it was, I think it was just the different stage that the United States as a whole had reached in terms of modernity and in terms of capitalism and consumerism. And it meant that my mum went to the States with she had like a lot of British people at the time. The only kind of understanding they had of the United States was through television, through movies, Hollywood, and so she had this idea of how it would be, kind of romanticized idea, of course. And then the reality was like had such a bigger impact, I think, that she was prepared for. Even the fact that people had guns and things like that. She told me, I remember when I was a kid, she was like, oh, we were staying in a hotel off Times Square, and we could hear gunshots at night, which is completely like at the same time in London, you just couldn't imagine, and then going into these supermarkets, which were just huge and just full of stuff, which again in the UK at that time, it just wasn't available. And the TV having all these different channels and then just advertising everywhere. It's like, I think it's hard for people to understand how shocking that was, because nowadays the UK is very much a modern, very modern 21st century country,
Right.
probably on a similar level to the US, but it wasn't in 77. I would say, London was about 20 years behind New York, really. So I think that kind of had a big impact on like a comment on her.
Well, and New York, Times Square, the Bowery, where CBGB's was in 1977, 78, were maybe two of the very worst places in the world for anyone who was going in with, a wide-eyed optimism and any kind of naivete. There's like war. I wouldn't be caught dead in 1977 Times Square, and I'm, significantly older than you and your mom probably combined. But I'm watching that footage, and I just can't help but think that you're placing someone who is, I don't want to say immature, but just unexperienced in the world, worldly to an extent, and then tossing her into a fire pit and expecting that it doesn't have an impact. And I think anytime you have someone who is young and thrust in a spotlight, in England, for example, being on top of the pops, that's a huge deal that many of us in the U.S. don't quite understand. But that was a huge deal. And then all of a sudden, you wonder why so many celebrities, young celebrities, struggle with trying to understand how to live your life as a normal human being in a situation that is absolutely not normal.
Absolutely. It's a really good point. And I think it's it's a shame that in the modern world, in modern society, we've set up all of these industries, including the music industry, to be something that you kind of are expected to do at a very young age. It's a horrifically ageist industry. So if you're like, in your 30s and you want to get start a music career, you're going to face so many closed doors, which is really messed up because in your 30s, maybe you're actually prepared, and you've developed and you've grown and you understand yourself and who you are. And I mean, it would be the perfect time to get into music. But no, it's like the industry wants kids. It wants people that they can shape and they can mold and they can manipulate, unfortunately.
There were a number of women that were narrating along the way in the film. Pauline Black from Selector and several others, and they all cite your mom as a major influence. So in spite of all of that, you still had someone who had so much promise and potential. She took these big breaks away from music to satisfy like a struggle of faith, I suppose you could say. And you mentioned Hari Krishna also. I mean, did she ever have any regrets or second guesses about being away from music for as long as she did, or did that really not matter to her at that point?
I think it was kind of on and off, how she felt about music, or she was conflicted, let's say. And so it was a constant conflict of, it's kind of like it didn't make her happy being in it, but she kind of was attracted to it constantly to go back, because obviously there were a lot of, she was a hugely creative person, and was music was just inside her, was in her bones. So even if she didn't like touring, she didn't like performing live, because of those experiences of like live gigs, and she didn't particularly like being on TV or any of that, but she loved writing and she loved singing and she loved performing. So I think it was, it's again, it's like in the modern society, we've created industries where artists, are not necessarily, they don't necessarily feel at home because they're artists, they're not industry professionals, and so I think she always struggled with that. She loved music and she loved writing and she loved creating, but yeah, she just, she couldn't spend too long in the machine, as it were.
You went through the process, and a lot of people do this when a loved one dies, or parent in particular, and you're going through some of her old things, some of her old stuff that she kept throughout her music career, and I'm sure a whole lot more stuff too, especially when she was with X-Ray Spex. What surprised you the most about sorting through her things and the kinds of things that she kept? What was the most surprising to you?
For me, was what surprised me was what she was actually doing at the time in terms of how prolific she was as a visual artist. So she had done all the artwork herself for the band by hand, so she designed the logo, she designed the album covers, posters, LP covers, she was designing the clothes, she was making her own clothes. And so in the archive, I could see all of this firsthand. I had a vague idea that she told me, oh, I used to do all the artwork. But until I actually saw the artwork and I could see the process, because I could see all the copies that she did by hand and tracing and how she did it, the process, like with the tracing paper and felt tip pens and going to photocopy shops. And, that was true DIY artistry there that, until I saw it for myself, I didn't really take it on board, like what it meant. Also because I'm of the generation where I grew up with computers and Photoshop and all of that. So, we didn't have to do anything like that by hand. So, it's really, that really impressed me. And that was kind of what prompted me to start this whole journey, really, was the archive and was the visual art, because I was just like, well, people don't really know my mum as a visual artist, but she absolutely was. And I kind of wanted to get that out there.
In your conversations with Paul Sung, who helped direct the film, for many documentary filmmakers, there's a very thin line between telling the truth and sensationalizing a story. And
Yeah.
I don't feel like that happened here. I think what happened here was it was a very sensitive portrayal of your mom about mental illness, without going to the point where It's exploiting that story. It's literally telling it how it is through your eyes. And I have to give both of you credit because it had to be a certain level of coordination and understanding on his part to make sure that it got done the right way.
Absolutely. And it's for Paul, of course, I could have been any, co-director's nightmare because I'm, I'm also kind of the subject of the film, and then I have to also be making the film alongside Paul. So, the big question is how much control over the narrative am I going to have, and how truthful am I going to be with what I present? And for me personally, I had to definitely like push myself sometimes to maybe reveal more than I would want to, but and then in order to do that, I had to separate myself from my own story. It's not easy, but it is really, at the same time, it was a really therapeutic process for me to be able to do that, because I think sometimes we do have to put distance between ourselves and our memories, in order to kind of keep going.
Like I said, I thought the film was terrific. I'm thrilled that the two of you are getting lots of praise for it. They got the two British Independent Film Awards. It's been at South by Southwest. You have to feel very happy with the final product and the way it's being received.
Absolutely. It's such a, just to hear people say that they've not only enjoyed the film, but that it's had an impact. You know what? And maybe it's even a negative impact for some people. But it's been overwhelmingly positive, and that's what we got involved. Why I got involved in this project is to have an impact. And for people to take something away from the film.
Well, like I said, congratulations. It is a beautiful film, and I appreciate the time you took to talk about it today. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Today's podcast, again, brought to you by Canna Provision in Holyoke and Lee, Massachusetts. Check them out on cannaprovisions.com. If you like the show, feel free to share it, like it, review it, tell all your friends. You can reach me at bax@rock102.com. I'd love to hear what you think, and thanks again for listening to Baxy's Musical Podcast.